The mayor of Windsor, Ontario is pushing back against U.S. threats of the new international bridge in his city, saying it should not open until it's right for Canada. The Gordie Howe International Bridge connecting Windsor and Detroit was expected to open this spring, but earlier this year, U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to block its opening unless Canada, which paid for the project in full, provides various concessions.
Donald Trump wanted the Gordie Howe Bridge to become leverage against Canada. Instead, it may be turning into another cost problem for American consumers, already struggling with expensive cars, rising logistics costs, and inflation fatigue. The bridge connecting Detroit and Windsor is basically finished. Canada paid for it. The trade corridor is ready. But instead of opening smoothly this spring, the project is now stuck inside a political fight between Washington and Ottawa. And the longer this drags on, the more businesses in Michigan are starting to ask a very simple question. Why is the United States slowing down one of the exact infrastructure projects designed to lower trade friction in the first place?
Earlier this month, U.S. Ambassador to Canada said the opening remains one of the various irritants between both countries.
The Windsor mayor saying this today.
I know that the U.S. government has put a proposition forward to the Canadian government, how they might find a pathway to open the bridge. And what I've said is, if it's a bad deal, don't take it, Canadian government. We're willing to let that bridge stay closed for a little while longer instead of taking a bad deal put forward by the United States.
The Gordie Howe International Bridge has been under construction since 2018. It stretches across the Detroit River between Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan, one of the busiest commercial trade corridors anywhere in North America. The project was originally sold as a practical solution to growing congestion at existing crossings, post-9/11 security concerns, and increasing pressure on North America's integrated manufacturing system. Canada agreed to finance the entire bridge project, including expensive infrastructure tied to the American side of the border crossing. For years, the expectation was straightforward. Once construction finished, traffic would begin flowing and trade efficiency would improve across the region. Then the politics changed. Earlier this year, Donald Trump publicly threatened to delay the opening unless the United States received additional concessions connected to broader trade disputes with Canada. Reports surrounding the negotiations included demands tied to U.S. alcohol access, financial compensation, and even discussion of possible American ownership stakes connected to the bridge project. That immediately triggered backlash from Canadian officials. Windsor Mayor Drew Dilkens responded publicly by saying Canada should not accept a bad deal simply to open the bridge faster. He argued that Ottawa had already honored every agreement and fully funded the project. At the same time, Michigan business groups began quietly expressing concern because the bridge delay was no longer just political theater. Now it was starting to affect real economic planning across the Detroit region. This is where the situation became awkward for the White House. Because the Gordie Howe Bridge was never designed as a symbolic project, it was designed to move freight faster. Every day, trucks crossing between Windsor and Detroit carry massive volumes of auto parts, industrial materials, engines, steel products, agricultural goods, and manufacturing equipment between factories in Canada and the American Midwest. The corridor handles hundreds of millions of dollars in trade daily and supports one of the most integrated manufacturing systems in the world. That system depends on timing. A transmission assembled in Ontario may be needed inside a Michigan plant just hours later. Delays ripple quickly across production schedules. That is exactly why the bridge was built. Not to create leverage, to remove bottlenecks. But now, instead of improving certainty, the bridge itself has become another source of uncertainty. And businesses notice that immediately, especially because Detroit manufacturers are already under pressure from Trump's broader tariff strategy. Industry studies have estimated Trump's auto tariffs could add more than $100 billion in costs across the American automotive sector. Some vehicles imported into the United States could become thousands of dollars more expensive. That means the White House is simultaneously increasing trade friction through tariffs while also increasing political uncertainty at the border, at the exact moment American consumers are already struggling with vehicle affordability.
At some point, the economic logic stops making sense even to businesses that normally support aggressive trade policies.
That pressure is now spilling directly into Michigan politics and business. Michigan's economy is tightly connected to cross-border manufacturing with Ontario, especially through the Detroit auto sector, where factories depend on parts and materials moving back and forth across the border every day. And unlike political messaging in Washington, assembly lines run on strict schedules. Manufacturers cannot afford constant uncertainty every time trade tensions escalate. That is why frustration has been growing inside Michigan itself. Governor Gretchen Whitmer recently said she expects the bridge to open soon, while Detroit business groups continue backing the project publicly because they see it as critical infrastructure for regional trade. Even labor groups are pushing for movement. Around 8,000 Michigan workers reportedly helped build the American side of the bridge using U.S. steel and construction materials, meaning the project already created jobs locally before the long-term trade benefits even begin. And the cost pressure inside the U.S. auto sector is already becoming difficult to ignore. Recent industry estimates tied to Trump's tariff policies suggest American automakers could face more than $100 billion in additional costs over time, while some imported vehicle prices may rise by several $1,000s per unit. Analysts have also warned that average vehicle prices in the United States could climb further, above the already elevated $50,000 range, if supply chain friction continues worsening. The Gordie Howe Bridge was originally designed to reduce congestion and improve freight efficiency across one of North America's busiest trade corridors. Instead, manufacturers are now watching a completed bridge sit unused, while delays and uncertainty continue building around future border operations. And politically, the timing could become dangerous heading toward the midterms. If inflation remains sticky, vehicle prices stay elevated, and manufacturing costs continue rising, voters in industrial states may start questioning whether these trade fights are actually helping them economically, especially when one of the easiest tools for improving trade efficiency is already physically sitting there completed over the Detroit River.
What makes the situation even more uncomfortable for Washington is that Canada does not need to escalate aggressively right now. Ottawa's strategy has increasingly been to stay measured, while American businesses, Michigan officials, and Detroit manufacturers apply pressure from inside the United States themselves. So far, that approach is working surprisingly well politically. Canada can point to a very simple sequence of events. Ottawa funded the project, completed the construction, honored the agreements, and secured the permits years ago. Yet the bridge still remains unopened because Washington is now attaching new political conditions after the fact. That creates a difficult optics problem for Trump internationally, especially at a time when global investors are already paying close attention to trade instability, tariffs, and supply chain risk across North America. For Mark Carney's government, the bridge dispute also reinforces a broader economic argument that Canada has been quietly building for months. Reducing overdependence on the United States may no longer be optional. That helps explain why Ottawa continues expanding trade discussions with Europe and Asia, while also accelerating domestic infrastructure, industrial investment, and export diversification projects at home. Ironically, Trump's pressure campaign may end up strengthening the exact Canadian strategy it was supposed to weaken.
Right now, the Gordie Howe Bridge is fully built, but politically frozen. The White House says broader issues still need to be addressed. Canada says the agreement was already fulfilled years ago. Michigan manufacturers want predictability. Detroit businesses want smoother trade flows. And American consumers are still absorbing rising costs across the auto market. That is the contradiction sitting at the center of this story. The bridge was built to make North American trade cheaper, faster, and more stable. Instead, it is becoming another source of uncertainty inside an economy already struggling with tariffs, inflation pressure, and manufacturing costs. And if this standoff continues much longer, Trump may discover that slowing down trade infrastructure hurts the American side of the border far faster than expected.
And yet, when we witness what has happened as Prime Minister Carney has made it clear that he no longer sees a future based upon hemispheric priorities for all of us, but instead, he now will look more and more to Europe. I've never met anybody in my career that was upset with Canada as a great friend of the United States.
The moment that changed the hearing was not a shouting match. It was hesitation. Jamison Greer entered Congress prepared to defend Trump's tariff strategy as proof that America was winning against Canada and other trading partners. But as lawmakers kept pressing him on rising consumer prices, supply shortages, and industrial costs, the argument started collapsing under its own contradictions, because the numbers are no longer lining up with the political slogan. Instead of isolating Canada, Trump's tariff pressure is accelerating Canada's global repositioning. Instead of forcing Ottawa into retreat, it is pushing allies and investors to treat Canada as the steadier long-term partner. And inside the United States, the economic pressure is no longer theoretical. Americans are now seeing the costs show up in construction, energy, food, manufacturing, and even basic consumer goods. That is why the mood in Congress suddenly shifted. Not because Canada beat the United States overnight, but because Washington is starting to realize this strategy is becoming expensive to sustain.
If I were to ask today, what is America's trade policy, I don't think anybody would know. It's generally based upon pronouncements and chaos. It offends long-term allies. It's driven away some of our best friends. There's the argument in the morning, the retreat in the afternoon, and the declaration of victory in early evening.
The congressional hearing focused on the Trump administration's escalating tariff framework ahead of broader trade negotiations expected to intensify through 2026. Jamison Greer attempted to argue that the administration's aggressive tariff posture was rebuilding American industry and forcing trading partners into concessions. But Democratic lawmakers repeatedly challenged the logic behind the policy, especially as pressures continue spreading through the U.S. economy. Several members pointed directly to sectors already feeling strain from cross-border disruptions. Auto manufacturing costs remain volatile. Construction inputs linked to Canadian materials continue facing upward pressure. Agricultural concerns are growing as fertilizer and supply costs remain elevated. Lawmakers also questioned whether the administration underestimated Canada's ability to adapt. That question matters because Canada did not respond to Trump's tariffs with panic. Ottawa responded with redirection. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government accelerated trade outreach toward Europe and Asia, expanded strategic discussions around LNG and critical minerals, and pushed investment policies aimed at reducing Canada's long-term exposure to Washington's political volatility. The hearing unintentionally exposed a growing fear inside parts of Congress. What if the United States triggered an economic confrontation that Canada is learning to navigate better than expected?
What we're paying for gasoline, what we're paying in the marketplace, what people are paying for fertilizer, it is driving considerations that heretofore would have been resolved in an amicable fashion. This damage is not theoretical. Jobs have been lost, supply chains have been disrupted, and last year there was really very little growth in job opportunities for the American people, with the exception of health care, which will be felt after the November elections, as well as it relates to our hospitals. Families are paying more.
The core problem facing the White House is simple. Tariffs are easier to announce than to contain. On paper, tariffs sound like pressure against foreign governments. In reality, integrated supply chains mean the economic shock often circles back into domestic markets. And Canada is not just another trading partner. The Canadian and American economies were built over decades to function together in energy, auto manufacturing, aerospace, agriculture, metals, and industrial production. Trying to suddenly politicize that system creates friction everywhere at once. That friction is now becoming visible. American manufacturers are dealing with higher input uncertainty. Construction costs remain sensitive to Canadian materials. Farmers are still dependent on Canadian potash and energy-linked supply chains. Even U.S. refiners remain deeply reliant on Canadian crude because many facilities are designed specifically for heavy Canadian oil. Congress understands this. That is why lawmakers during the hearing kept returning to the same issue. If tariffs are supposed to strengthen the American economy, why do so many American sectors still appear structurally dependent on Canada?
That question is politically dangerous because it undermines the entire easy replacement narrative. One reason the Trump administration appears increasingly frustrated is because Canada stopped playing defense. Under Mark Carney, Ottawa has gradually reframed the dispute as a long-term restructuring project rather than a short-term trade fight. Instead of matching every American escalation headline for headline, Canada focused on making itself harder to pressure. That strategy is showing results. Canada's LNG sector is attracting stronger international attention as Europe seeks stable, non-Russian energy sources and buyers look for politically reliable suppliers. Canadian critical minerals are becoming more valuable as Western governments race to secure battery and defense supply chains outside China. At the same time, Canada is strengthening ties with Asian and European partners precisely when many countries are becoming uneasy with Washington's increasingly unpredictable trade posture. This is the irony Congress accidentally exposed during the hearing. Trump's tariffs were designed to pull production and leverage back toward the United States, but in practice, they are also encouraging allies to diversify away from American political risk. And Canada is positioning itself as the alternative. Not louder, not bigger, just more stable. That is a powerful message in a volatile global economy. The hearing also revealed something broader happening inside American politics: tariff fatigue. Back in Trump's first term, tariffs were often framed as a bold negotiating tactic with manageable side effects. In 2026, the situation feels different because Americans are already exhausted by years of inflation, high borrowing costs, and economic uncertainty. Now add rising trade friction on top of that. The political problem for the White House is that consumers rarely separate inflation into categories. They do not care whether higher prices came from tariffs, shipping disruptions, commodity volatility, or supply chain friction. They just see costs rising again. That creates pressure on lawmakers, especially in industrial and agricultural states tied closely to Canadian trade. A senator from a farming state does not view Canadian potash as an ideological issue. They view it as fertilizer costs. A manufacturer in Michigan or Ohio does not care about trade slogans if industrial inputs become more expensive and contracts become less predictable. And this is where Canada gains leverage, because Ottawa is increasingly presenting itself internationally as the calm actor responding to American escalation. The more Washington intensifies the tariff rhetoric, the easier it becomes for Canada to look economically disciplined by comparison. The hearing exposed one fear that few in Washington openly admit. What if Canada becomes less dependent on the United States faster than the United States becomes less dependent on Canada? That possibility changes everything. For decades, Washington assumed economic gravity guaranteed Canadian alignment. But global energy demand, critical minerals, Arctic trade routes, AI infrastructure investment, and geopolitical fragmentation are giving Canada new strategic importance beyond the American market alone. Canada is no longer just the neighbor. It is becoming a resource, energy, and infrastructure platform that multiple global powers increasingly want access to, and that reality weakens the effectiveness of pure tariff pressure over time. Congress may not have intended to highlight that shift, but during the hearing, the cracks in the old assumptions became impossible to ignore. Jamieson Greer entered Congress expecting to defend Trump's tariff strategy as a show of economic strength. Instead, the hearing exposed growing anxiety inside Washington itself, not because Canada launched some dramatic retaliation overnight, but because the underlying math is changing. The more tariffs disrupt integrated North American supply chains, the more American consumers and industries start sharing the pain. Meanwhile, Canada is adapting faster than many in Washington predicted. It is building new trade relationships, expanding strategic sectors, positioning itself as a stable supplier in an increasingly unstable world. And now, even parts of Congress are beginning to realize something politically uncomfortable. Trump's tariffs may be pushing Canada away far faster than they are bringing America back together.